Thank you for tuning in. This is DJ Fob Fresh from SEGASHIRO.com, the Sega resource, and today we're looking at a game from 1995 on the Sega Saturn. It's entitled Warp. It was published by Acclaim, and it's known to many as D. Every so often you get a game where the backstory behind the development of the game and the creators is actually far more interesting than the game itself. And unfortunately, D is an example of that. In fact, it's a classic example of that. If the legends behind this title were actually true, this was one of the most horrifyingly graphic video games at the time. And the developer was scared that the uncut, uncensored version wouldn't be released. So he actually handed in a phony clean disc and then swapped it right before he handed it in to the publishers. And that's how they got around censorship. Development for this title initially started in 1994 for the 3DO console. It was up to Acclaim Entertainment, who during the Sega Saturn era were often known as being some of the worst publishers around. However, they took this title and published it for the Saturn, the PlayStation, and the PC, so kudos to them for that. Now, if you're wondering why I'm giving kudos to Acclaim for publishing this title, it's because it's altogether a strange title to see on a console. Now, in fact, this game is more of an interactive movie than it was a typical North American game. And in fact, interactive movies were far more popular in Japan. So if you had lots of anime games come out that were essentially cutscenes from a show or just for the game, and you kind of acted out through these cutscenes, D plays in many ways like that. Essentially, you have a 2-hour frame to beat this game. So in many ways, it is only a 2-hour game. Now, the trick to that is that you have a real-time clock that runs, you're not allowed to pause. So essentially, the only time and the best way to play this game is on October 31st, you sit down with a buddy, and you play it in one shot. Now, the title sold well in Japan, reasonably well, at least at first, and in North America, it was critically panned. I mean, and essentially the complaint was you were paying for 2 hours of gameplay, and no one in their right mind really wants to pay for 2 hours of gameplay. I mean, that isn't to say that there aren't multiple endings, but the ways to get to the endings it's exactly the same. So there's essentially one route through the game, and all of sort of the ending options rely on whether or not you find enough items of a specific type of item, the scarabs, during the gameplay, and sort of your final choice at the end of the game. Now, despite the 2-hour time length of the game and the sort of monotonous gameplay of having to play the same areas again to try to unlock one of the 3 different endings, on one level I have to give the developers credit for sticking to their guns and keeping with their artistic vision. I mean, in that sense alone, there aren't a lot of games that will stick it to the game player instead of pander to the game player, and this is one game that really stuck to its guns, and that deserves some kind of credit. Gameplay-wise, this game is kind of slow and plodding. The atmosphere is wonderful, however, the pace feels right off, and I think that's due to the time limit. So, I mean, in one way, you're stressed for time, yet Laura moves so slowly. The game hasn't aged well over the years, but at the time it was new and it was fresh at the time. It just, now in retrospect, it doesn't look as strong as it once did. Again, also with the puzzle elements, they weren't particularly challenging. If anything, there were only times where they were frustrating. So most gamers will get through all of the puzzles, solve them on their first go, and it's just things about the game itself that will slow you down. It's kind of the way Laura moves, the way she's slow. There was one room where I had to turn the dial for certain doors to come up, and it was random which doors appeared. So it wasn't that I couldn't solve the puzzle, I couldn't even get to the puzzle in time to solve it. Now, the game was home to a couple of sequels, which also featured the character of Laura. She was sort of a reoccurring character in all of Warp's games. Now, you had D2 on the Dreamcast, which was significantly better, and kind of in most game players' eyes has much better gameplay. And then you have Enemy Zero, which was a Sega Saturn exclusive, which we'll be looking at down the line eventually. Overall, I can't give this game a straight recommendation. However, if you're a hardcore collector, it might be worth looking into, and especially if you can get it in on the cheap. That would probably be the best way to look at it. This is DJ Fob Fresh, signing out, saying keep on gaming.